Okay, so this is a debate. It's a debate on an exciting topic, and hopefully the intellectual interest of it is what has brought many people here. I can well imagine, though, that the fact of it being a debate is itself of interest. We all like a good contest, so maybe some people are here just for the gunfight at the OK Corral. In hopes that that we could frame the debate a little bit, I have been emailing to find out what the that they find it difficult to articulate where the differences would be. In fact, it got me to the point of saying, well, actually, are there any differences at all? Because every time we started thinking about the fact that culture is the result of psychological mechanisms that have been selected through genetic processes, and I would say, so are we agreed about that? Are we disagreed about that? No, it turns out that we're all agreed about that. But there were efforts by Max and Joe to say, well, maybe we disagree about this, and then they would say, no, we agree about that. So eventually one of them wrote and said, we can't even agree on what we disagree about. Well, I was hoping that there would be points that I could suggest that you would be alert to as you listen to their presentations. I think you're just going to have to work it out for yourselves. They do promise that there will be points of disagreement and that they will emerge during the presentation. So here's what the format is for this evening. We are going to have presentations, first of all, by Joe and then by Max. That was the result of their visiting random.org. It wasn't just from seniority that Joe goes first. And those will be 20-25 minutes each, and then we will have questions that I will lead off, and then we'll have questions from the audience. So without further ado, Joe is going to give the first presentation.
It's great to be here with everybody. I have way too much to say on these topics, so I know that Richard will discipline me and make sure I stay within my time. Okay, so I've just published this book, which kind of gives the summary of my thinking on this topic. So in 3 slides, I'm going to try to tell you what I think the key ideas are here that Max may or may not disagree with. I'll kind of emphasize the ones where I think there might be an edge or two. So I begin with this idea that we're a cultural species, that we're unlike other species, and that we become addicted to acquiring cultural information that's accumulated in previous generations. So if I were to take you all and deposit you in the Ituri forest and also take a group of capuchin monkeys from Central America and we played a game of Survivor, you guys would unlikely, despite your large brains and ample hubris about your intelligence, be able to defeat the capuchin monkeys in this game of Survivor. And that's because foragers who've been studied by anthropologists all over the world rely on a large body of cultural information to survive. Now, to approach these cultural abilities, my colleagues and we think of them as adaptations for culture. So what natural selection is acting on in our brains, it's building a cultural learning machine, making us better at selecting, identifying, and drawing out the useful information that's stored implicitly in the minds and behaviors of other members of our social group. And this gives rise to a second system of inheritance. So there's this accumulating body of selected information that's then running in parallel. And I'll say more about that in a second. So I think a lot of interesting human adaptations are actually created by culture-driven genetic evolution, where culture is creating the selection pressures that then drive genetic evolution. Now, one of the things I won't have much time to spend on today is that crucial to this process of cumulative cultural evolution, it turns out it depends on the size and interconnectedness of the society. So if you're able to scale up and be a larger, more interconnected group, you can actually generate fancier tools, technologies, bodies of know-how. You get better adapted to the environment. So the question is, how do you scale up? And then finally, I developed this idea of self-domestication, which other people have worked on. But in my case, culturally transmitted rules about how you have to behave are doing the work. They're doing the selecting of domesticating our species. Okay, Now, just to say a little bit more about these parallel lines of cultural evolution. So at some point in our species' evolutionary history, I take my best shot in the book at figuring out when that might be. I have a couple different scenarios depending on certain pieces of evidence. But it gave rise to this cumulative process where information begins to accumulate over generations. And we don't see this in any other primates. So that begins to make increasingly complex tools, things like cooking and fire, tracking, better food processing techniques. Once this process begins to go, your only game in town as a learner, you can't figure this stuff out on your own because it quickly becomes too complicated for anyone to figure out in their lifetime, and there's too many different things. So the name of the game is to figure out who to learn from and to extract as much of this information from your social milieu. So this selects for larger brains that are better at acquiring, storing, and organizing all this information. But then, of course, as brains get better at this, the whole process just speeds up, and you can create an autocatalytic interaction between the two inherited systems. Now, it appears that this hit stops. There's some basic constraints created by the primate basic plan of the human body. Babies' heads can only get so big, but of course this track has kept spiraling ever since. And of course, eventually we offload information extrasomatically, and I even argue that it leads to the division of labor. So we talk about the division of labor between males and females that we find in small-scale societies, but actually it's a division of information. So we've studied this in our field sites in Fiji, and men and women have different bodies of knowledge that the others don't know. So it's a way of dividing up the load. Now, I'm going to kind of speed through this slide, but I wanted to point out that we're using the logic of natural selection to say something about how humans learn. And then this gives rise, through cultural evolution, to a bunch of things which become selective forces. So evolutionary psychologists like myself, I wear many hats, so I'll also claim to be an anthropologist, maybe an economist sometimes, talk about ancestral, the recurrent features of our ancestral environments. I think that is an important thing. But what I want to emphasize here is that these recurrent features of our ancestral environments were produced by cultural evolution, by cumulative cultural evolution. So there's a lot of examples here I could run through. The first one I like to use is this work by Richard Wrangham, where our teeth are too small, our gapes are too small, our stomachs are too small, our colons are too short for a primate of our size. But if you take into account that we're a primate who uses fire and cooks, and then you recognize that actually we don't seem to have an ability to just make fire. If I were all drop you guys in Western Massachusetts and say, okay, make some fires and start cooking, you'd be hard-pressed to be able to make a fire without any technology. But yet our bodies have been changed by this cultural practice. And of course, we accumulate large bodies of knowledge, so we have some specialized cognition here. My colleague Dan Lieberman has argued that we have these specializations for running, which include some fancy sweat glands. So our bodies are covered in acrine sweat glands. The problem is there's an engineering flaw in this system. There's no water tank. It turns out when you study hunter and gatherers who engage in persistence hunting, they use cultural know-how to find water, and they also make technology in the form of water containers. So it's a culture gene package that co-evolved there. Now, there's a bunch of other pieces of psychology that I think evolved through this process, and this is quite a longer list if you look in the book. I'm going to talk more about norms. One interesting one I've worked on is that I think that humans have two kinds of status: a dominant status that we get from other primates, and a prestige status that emerges once we can learn from each other, because then other members of your social group become reservoirs of information that you could potentially tap into. Before you're a sufficiently good learner, you can't take advantage of that. But once you can, certain informational dynamics take off and a bunch of things flow from there. So in order to do, okay, I'm going to say this on the next slide. Okay, what's important here for thinking about how to do evolutionary psychology, apply evolutionary thinking to human behavior, is that you got to include the culture gene coevolutionary process, the interactive, alongside the more traditional, the more canonical approaches, which just look at genetic evolutionary processes. Now, one thing that's interesting, and this is just kind of an observation, is that biologists studying birds, studying learning in fish and rodents, and also cetaceans, have grabbed a hold of these models. So this is a case where models developed with humans in mind have gone back into the biology literature, been adopted by biologists to help explain behavior they see in other species. Mostly what researchers have done is take models from evolutionary biology and try to apply them to humans. So this is one case where it went backwards. And mathematical evolutionary biologists are now building these gene culture coevolutionary models. I think the methods that one comes to, that one needs once one has this perspective, is different from the methods typically used by psychologists. So I'm going to argue that humans, because of this adaptive learning constructed brain that we have, we can change our brains, we can change our hormones through the cultural environments we construct. It also changes our anatomy. So the book's full of examples, but one obvious one that people may know about is if you learn to read, you actually get some specialized neural circuitry in your left hemisphere that you don't have otherwise. So that's a biological change due to a cultural practice that people engage in. I'll mention testosterone, and of course if you grow up in our society, you wear shoes like these, your feet don't look how they're supposed to. People in small-scale societies, their toes stick way out so they can grab the ground, but you end up with deformed feet. Weird feet. So I think we need to study diverse communities all over the world using longitudinal studies that deploy the full arsenal of tools from the behavioral sciences, experiments, observations, interviews, biomarkers, and doing the genetics. And this is what my colleagues and I have been pursuing. This is a couple of volumes we've produced where we try to do this systematic work. What we don't need, and what we have quite a bit of, are people running experiments with undergraduates. So I'm for shifting the balance in favor of this other approach. Okay, now I want to dig in and try to lay out some things about the evolution of cooperation. Normally I start with some game theoretic models, but I'm using a totally different approach today. So I'm starting with a piece of ethnography. So this is the puzzle of Ilihita, and the anthropologist Anthony Forge was traveling around the Sepik region of New Guinea, and he noticed that all the villages in the region had a max of about 300 people. Once they got over about 300 people, they'd fraction and fall apart. They typically would split along clan lines, so all these groups are patrilineal clans. Now this is a puzzle because this is an area of endemic warfare, and the technology is widely shared amongst the groups, so your ability to defend your village and to have a secure home where people won't drive you out with constant raiding depends on your ability to put numbers of people on the field. So if you could have a bigger community, you could be safer, you could expand your territory, you could have more resources. Yet these villages keep falling apart at 300. Except Anthony Forge ran across this one Arapesh village, Ilihita, who had 1,500 people, so 5 times larger than any other village in the region, uniting 7 different clans. So in the 60s, the anthropologist Donald Tuzin went to say, what's going on here? How can this village do this? The previous theory had assumed it was ecology, but Ilihita proves that it's not ecology, or at least not on the surface. Okay, so when he studied this, he found out that they had something called the Tambaran system. So like other Arapesh groups and other groups in the community, they had patrilineal clan structures. But on top of that, they had an 8-tier dual moiety system. So these are subgroups that cross-cut the clans. And as a man, you're a member of one of these moieties, and you have a bunch of moiety buddies who are in other clans. Now, these moieties have ritual and economic obligations, so they have to grow yams and perform complex rituals with each other. Now, one of these rituals, they have some communal rituals, but they also have these initiation rites that they have to go through. And every man has to go through, and he's dependent on his moiety, on the other members of his moiety in order to get him through these rites. So in order to marry, ascend in status, and eventually become an elder, he has these interdependent relations with other members of his moiety. And he's also dependent on people higher up in the chain of these rites to kind of promote them and help them get through it. So the idea is it's creating interconnectedness. So Tuzin makes the observation that he thinks, that this is an ethnographic observation, that these features of culture are having a psychological effect on the men by creating mutual independence, forcing them to do joint projects together, and engaging in these rituals. A couple different features of the ritual. Now, there's now good reason to believe that Tuzin was in fact right, because there's research done by psychologists in related fields showing that joint participation in different kinds of rituals actually does build solidarity and cooperation. So you can think of this as a kind of mind hack in order to get people to cooperate together. Okay, now this whole system is embedded in beliefs about the Tambaran gods. Now, these gods are different from the usual gods that you find around here. So these typical clans would have an ancestor god, and that's just a god for that clan, worried about proper behavior in that clan. But these were village-level gods that were concerned about things in the village. And here you can see they're building something. This is going to be way larger than any other building in the whole region. And of course, it's a spirit house. It's where the god's going to live. And this imbues daily life, so people are growing yams and conducting these rituals for these Tambaran gods. And the gods, they believe, impose the dual moiety system, and they feed the gods with yams, pigs, and there's a cannibalistic element to that. So you raid other communities and steal people and feed them to the gods. Okay, and in return for all this service, the gods bless the community with military success and solidarity. Now, what seems to be going on here is that people themselves believe the rituals are for the god. But Tuzin's analysis, consistent with the research in psychology, is that actually it's the combination of the dual moiety system combined with these rituals that are building solidarity between the clans and preventing the usual fissioning that you see occurring in the other villages. So because of these emotional bridges that are built with this cultural technology, you're able to sustain a community of 1,500 people and have the military success. So they do the rituals because of the god, but it ends up having the effect of leading to success. So right effect, wrong theory. Okay, now Tuzin reconstructs using ethnohistory and some comparative ethnology between these different regions where this system came from. So there's lots of intergroup conflicts in this region. And he estimates around 1870, another group called the Ablam were aggressively expanding. So they were creating refugees, people were fleeing from them as they expanded their territory. And they had an earlier version of the Tambaran. So there were some refugees from Ablam that ended up kind of washing up in Ilahita, and they knew about the Tambaran. And these guys said, well, those guys must have some special contact with the spirit, so we're going to do what they do, and we're going to adopt the Tambaran, because we need this ritual power to defend ourselves against these guys. So they adopt the practices. The problem is they made some mistakes, because they must have got some bad information from the other guys. So the dual moiety system amongst the Ablam didn't cross-cut the clans. It was mostly within the clans with very little cross-cutting. When they laid it on top of their system, it cross-cut the clans, so it worked better. Also, the Ablam's gods were clan gods. They called them the Tambaran gods, but they were just a collection of the clan gods. The folks in Iliata already had clan gods, so these couldn't be their clan gods, so these became village-level gods over top of the local clan gods. So they got promoted. This turns out to have an effect of damping witchcraft beliefs, or witchcraft accusations. And a higher initiation level was added. So the Ablam had 4 initiation levels, so they brought those over. But the Iliata already had 1, so 4 plus 1 is 5, and you would go through all those. This turns out to be a crucial modification because among the Ablam, the oldest men would age out of the system. They would become powerless and lose their status. So key decisions were being made by younger men. In this system, the oldest men are the most senior men. So you change the sort of leadership structure. Now old men are making the decisions instead of younger men. You can see this is the Ablam house that looks very similar to the one in Ilahita. Okay, so the points here, the first one is that scaling up is hard to do. Humans aren't naturally good cooperators. We need technology, we need social technologies or institutions that help us scale up. And I'm going to argue in a second that these things actually interpenetrate us and change our biology. And I'll give you an example of that. Not our genetics, our biology. Now, if you begin to break this down like I like to break down these systems, the clans themselves aren't a natural product of our psychology. We find clans all over the world, but they harness pieces of our evolved psychology. So they harness our kinship instincts and our incest aversion and our pair bonding. Marriages are an important part of the story. And they build a corporate group. And they solve a basic problem in kinship is that there are conflicts of interest between your relatives. So you might get a cousin from one side of your family and a cousin from another side of your family to do a joint project. But you're related to those guys equally, but they're not related to each other at all. So there are conflicts of interest in terms of who, what's what. This eliminates that by suppressing one half of your relatives and emphasizing another half of your relatives. The dual moiety system normally is about marriage, so it takes advantage of pair bonding, incest, and paternity certainty instincts, but not here. These guys use ritual and economic interdependence. They do communal rituals where the whole community eats together, not something that's normally done. This probably creates sociality cues, and they have initiations that bond men together. So these guys have to do very frightening things, which has this bonding effect in the rituals. And of course, due to an error in transmission, essentially, they end up with a bigger god. And these gods we're able to understand gods and think about things like supernatural punishment because of evolved psychological mechanisms. But as I'll point out in a second, not all gods are equally good at ramping up cooperation. So the way I think about this is that these culturally transmitted practices, social norms, beliefs can monkey with our aspects of our evolved psychology, and this allows us to scale up human cooperation. So just to show you that one of the key points I want to make is that many social norms and evolved social norms plus aspects of our evolved psychology are not equally effective. So there's many ways to rig these things up and interconnect them, and some are better than others at generating cooperation. So the ableum had a cross-cutting moiety system. It just wasn't a very good one because it didn't cross-cut very much. So you can make a better one. Bigger gods or god of the village is going to be better able to galvanize cooperation in the community compared to clan gods who have disputes amongst each other. Also, I don't think all marriage norms are equally effective at maintaining internal harmony. So I have a whole line of work on the effects of monogamous marriage. And I think I could convince you that in our society, monogamous marriage norms lead men to have 2 reductions in testosterone. And most men can get married because there's, we're redistributing the women from the rich guys, unlike polygynous societies. And this causes men to have a testosterone drop when they get married and again when they have children. In polygynous societies, and Richard actually has a paper on this, you don't see the declines in testosterone. So having monogamous marriage norms is a testosterone suppression system. It alters our biology. Okay, that's that point. And finally, just a general point, reputation can incentivize anything. So you'll often see this contrast between, cultural group selection on one side and reputation explanations on the other. But those are actually the same explanation because you have to figure out what gets into your reputational system. Are you going to give people a bad reputation for not eating the brains of dead relatives, as the foray did for years, and it was very difficult to suppress, turned out to transmit a horrible prion disease? Or are you going to give people reputation for not eating members of their family and transmitting prion disease? You can do either one. Societies have done both. Okay, so just to give you the big picture here, so cultural evolution can generate a diversity of different norms. They're not all equal. We want to think about how cultural learning does that, but we also want to keep in mind it's working with an evolved psychology that it's going to use. Lots of cultural evolutionary models can show that you can get cooperation here, but you can also get lots of other stuff. Now, this can lead to all kinds of different institutional systems. I've proposed, and many others, many of my colleagues, Rob Boyd, Pete Richardson, that this one process that can sort amongst all these different kinds of institutions or institutional packages is intergroup competition. Now, the most common form that people think of is intergroup conflict, so warfare. Another one is biased immigration. If people are inclined to move to more successful societies, those societies grow and expand at the expense of others. You can also do what the ableum did, which is copy the more successful guys. They have a really good ritual cult. We're going to get it. Turns out this is rampant in New Guinea ethnography. I can give you case after case. Polly Wiesner has a whole book on it. And demographic expansion. So some groups are able to just have more babies. Babies become culture barrows, and they expand at the expense of other groups. Now, we get to both of these using the logic of natural selection. So all this is anchored in evolutionary theory. It's just that there are emergent processes. And like this is one of prestige where you can't even get the evolved psychology right, in my opinion, unless you take that into account. Okay, so then this can lead to this co-evolved psychology. I alluded to this before, so norm psychology I'll talk about briefly. And if I have time, I'm going to talk about this link. So it's crucial for this whole story that people be able to use their cultural learning to acquire social behavior. So maybe there's controversy there. Now, I really want to put my finger on, maybe it's a point of disagreement between Max and I. So this is an abstract from one of Max's papers, and he characterizes this view here. A common explanation is third-party punishment exists to maintain a cooperative society, but we tested a different explanation. Third-party punishment is psychology of deterrence for defending personal interest. Okay, so that's presented as, and by the way, in the paper, I'm cited 2 out of the 3 sites for this stupid idea. It seems to be a contrast between this and this. But let's go back to the Ilahita. So these guys believe that if they don't perform these rituals properly, then the God won't bless them and they won't get a life of security and good. So they believe they have a direct self-interest. If anybody falls out of line on the ritual performance, you got to get those guys back in line because the God's not going to bless us. But then doing the ritual causes this bonding and then leads the community to have greater success, confirming the God theory of victory in this case. So you have this internal system which interlocks with itself and is difficult to falsify and can persist for time and allow you to scale up cooperation. This is completely consistent with the personal interest theory of these guys are doing it because they believe it's the right thing for them to do. They get benefits from it. But you got to figure out where these beliefs came from. You need a story that says why these beliefs as opposed to all the other beliefs that wouldn't allow us to scale up cooperation. So these are not antagonistic necessarily. They fill in different parts of the story. Yeah, so in this case, we know where these beliefs come and they were copied from the Abelin. And I can give you more and more of these examples. So studies of foraging among small-scale societies shows that lots of food sharing occurs due to food taboos, where you have to, can only eat part of the animal. But if anybody eats the part different from the one that they're supposed to eat, the tabooed part for them, then the whole group gets bad hunting. Now I have a personal interest to police everyone and make sure they only eat the part they're allowed to, because my hunting, future hunting success is going to be affected by that. Okay. Skip that. Okay. Just wanted to make a few points about the cultural learning of social behavior. So there's quite a bit of evidence showing that people will learn all kinds of social behaviors by observing others. And so work by Mike Tomasello and his colleagues at Leipzig show that children will copy all kinds of social behavior, even seemingly arbitrary norms, so how to play a game. They'll copy it in one shot observation, and they'll sanction or at least get really angry at any puppets that come by and happen to violate the rules. So this isn't about cooperation or anything like that. It's just we're geared up to learn what the local rules are, and we bring a package. We're already ready to punish or get upset at norm violators. There's a long tradition in psychology, starting in the late 1960s and about 78 or 79 it starts to die out, of showing kids models that are either generous in giving to charity, strangers, or selfish in giving to strangers. And you can basically make kids more generous or more selfish in these studies. Now, interestingly, these endure. So if you show it to the kid 1 week, you bring him back in 3 months later, he's still more generous or more selfish in this context, but only in this context. It doesn't extend to other contexts. And of course, there's a lot of, not a lot, there's 4 or 5 papers showing that cultural learning people will learn dictator game behavior, so these tools from behavioral economics. They'll learn public goods game behavior, and they'll learn third-party punishing in experiments. So these things all seem to be culturally transmittable. Now I want to bring in the economists. So the economists are hot on culture. There's a great deal. I mean, you can't characterize the whole field, but there's certainly a group within economics that's convinced culture matters. And one of the fun things they do is they take migrants, so second-generation migrants to the US or within Europe or even within Italy. And these are people who've grown up their entire lives in the US. They've never been back to the home country. But then they use the home country average, say for something like trust, to predict the second or third generation immigrants. And it turns out it's a good predictor. So something from that home country is getting into that person's head who grew up their entire life in the US, and you can control for income and education and all that kinds of stuff, and it holds up. Now, interestingly, these trust measures these guys use are also correlated with behavioral games. So that suggests a kind of inheritance for all of those things. And that graph is just an example of that. Okay, so I want to do 5 challenges of human cooperation. So these, I think, any approach to human cooperation has to meet these challenges. So why is the scale and intensity of human cooperation so much greater than other animals? So if you have a theory of cooperation, you have to ask yourself, well, does this only apply to humans, or should I be applying this to other species? And I've argued that we have a very specific, human-specific theory because only we have this kind of cumulative cultural evolutionary process that drives our genetic evolution. Lots of other theories about human cooperation, say based on direct reciprocity, ought to apply to chimps. So we should see chimps behaving in cooperative ways. Second one, so why does the scale of intensity of cooperation and collective action vary so dramatically across societies and across domains within societies? So in terms of domains, I worked in the Peruvian Amazon, and I had groups, different ethnic groups that lived right down the river from each other, and one group would cooperate in fishing but not warfare and house building, and the other group down the river would cooperate in warfare and house building but not fishing. So you need to explain why these domains could be like that. Now, the explanation I've just given you is that you get social norms for specific domains, and this process of intergroup competition is going to gradually combine these, but over long periods of time. It's a slower process than other aspects of culture. Okay, then finally, a couple more. Why has the scale and intensity of human cooperation and collective action expanded so dramatically in the last 10,000 years, while it hasn't in other species? So the account I have given is that or not now, but in other work, the climate stabilized, and actually around 18,000 years ago, last glacial maximum, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere starts increasing. So the potential is there for sedentary agriculture. Once you get sedentary agriculture, you get a crucible of cultural group selection. Groups begin competing, and that can create the scaling up that we've seen in the last 10,000 years. An important one is, why do the same mechanisms that seem to stabilize cooperation also apply to non-cooperative things like food taboos and sexual practices and rituals? So why do people engage in third-party punishment for ritual violations, for example? All right. Now, the cultural evolutionary models I work with can stabilize all kinds of stuff and leads to the concept of norms and places the emphasis on that instead of cooperation. All right, and then finally, doing research in diverse societies has taught me that different societies use different mechanisms in different ways. So some societies you might have signaling playing an important role or indirect reciprocity playing an important role. In other societies you might have some kind of third-party punishment or some of the other things I mentioned earlier. So different societies seem to have turned the trick in different ways by harnessing our evolved cognition in different ways in different places. All right, so I am out of time. And so I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Joe. Max, you're just going to change computers?
Yep.
Okay, so what we heard from there was someone with an anthropological background who has incorporated psychology, economics into his perspective, but is not trained specifically in evolutionary psychology. He uses evolution and psychology, so to that extent he's an evolutionary psychologist with small e, small p. Is that a fair way to put it, Joe?
I'm happy with that, although I have trained graduate students in psychology who want to be professors.
Okay, yeah. So here we're going to hear from someone whose training comes in evolutionary psychology with a capital E and a capital P, who was trained, incidentally, by John Tooby and Lida Cosmides, who come from Harvard. So it's rather nice that you return here. And John Tooby was in anthropology, and Lida Cosmides was in psychology. Max.
Thank you very much, Richard. Ooh, am I getting feedback between these microphones? Does it sound weird?
You're good.
Okay. Maybe just this way. Okay. Thanks, Richard. Thanks to the MBB Steering Committee for organizing this event. Let me start out with the following observation. I think that, and other people agree, that one of the big problems with humans being the ones that are doing the science of psychology is that we're just way too familiar with the experience of being human. William James, the guy whom this building is named for, saw this issue plainly. In The Principles of Psychology, James writes, "It takes a mind debauched to carry the process of making the natural seem strange so far as to ask the why of any instinctive human act. To the metaphysician alone, and not, the rest of us, can such questions occur as, why do we smile when pleased and not scowl? Why does a particular maiden turn our wits so upside down? The common man can only say, of course we smile, of course we love the maiden." And this goes on and on at length. Nowadays, we call this the problem of instinct blindness, and it goes something like this. Most of the complex problems that our brain solves happen without us ever having to attend to their solution, such that in the absence of our attention, these problems seem trivially easy to solve, and we have a hard time imagining how they could be done any differently than they are. Let me give you an example to illustrate the point. If you haven't taken coursework in the vision science from some of the great members of our vision lab, and I asked you the following question, what is it like to see? You would probably reflect on your experience and think that it's a pretty easy process. And if I asked you to describe that process, you'd say that it was something like, well, the world exists, and we have this visual system, like eyes and stuff, and what our eyes do is they just give us a representation of the world to our brains. And you actually would be in pretty good company for thinking that this was a simple process. This is probably an apocryphal story, but the story goes that back in the 1970s and down the road at MIT, the great Marvin Minsky thought that the problem of vision was so easy that it would take one grad student working for one summer to teach a robot to see the way that humans can.
Max, it's a true story, but except it was an undergraduate.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve.
Gary Sussman.
That graduate student or undergraduate was probably never seen from again. It's now 50 years later, and we know that vision is actually a really hard problem. Vision scientists have finally uncovered a lot of what it takes to get humans to see, and it isn't anything like this process. In contrast, it takes a tremendous amount of the brain to do a lot of hyper-specific processing to get that simple process of vision done. We need to do things like carve that scene into edges and spatial orientations and spatial frequencies and contours and colors and saliency and scene statistics and on and on and on, and combine all of these features in a complex architecture in order to get the problem of vision done. Unfortunately, simple intuition doesn't give us access to any of these processes or the architecture that connects them together. And if it wasn't for the fact that we have scientists that are carefully dissecting the information processing problems going on in human vision, we wouldn't have gotten at these answers. I think there's a general lesson here for the rest of us. What feels consciously easy or transparently accomplished is likely to rely on an immense hidden structure of complex machinery. Now, you might say, we know this, we know instinct blindness, we've been paying attention for the past 20 years. Why are you pointing this out? The reason I'm pointing this out is that the social world feels just as intuitive as vision, but my guess is it's likely to be even more complicated. We do so many social things intuitively, without attending to them. We see people act, and from that observation infer things like their mental states and their desires to explain their actions, things that we don't have actual access to. Like this lady thinks there's something in her purse and wants to get it, even though we have no evidence that that's the case. We infer who's allied with whom and who would back who in a fight. We understand property rights. We understand the logic of exchange. We can identify cases of cheating, like that. We can leverage information, as Joe says, from the minds of others to learn what they know and how to do what they do. And we can determine from what others do what is and what isn't done. We can just look at people's faces and attribute things about their character, about their personality, about their characteristics. And this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to social behavior. Time is short, so I can only give you a few examples of what I mean here, but hopefully they'll illustrate for you how far we can get by taking the psychology that underlies these adaptive problems, that solves these adaptive problems seriously. Let's first look at the case of social exchange. Ancestral hominids, our ancestors, for at least the last million years, have been hunting and gathering nutritionally denser foods than your average grazer or browser did. Now, these foods are more valuable, sure, but they're also more risky and hard to acquire, such that very often, our ancestors came back empty-handed. This sets up the potential for much larger gains in trade than you get in your typical grazing and browsing ecology, answering some of the questions of why we see these adaptations emerging in humans and not in other animals. But one of the things these gains in trade enable is the possibility of doing risk pooling, such that the successful can share with the unsuccessful. And the gains in trade can be enabled by the successful sharing with each other when they've each specialized at different kinds of tasks. This gain in trade itself, though, is risky, as there's no guarantee that if I share with you today, that you'll share with me tomorrow. Therefore, mechanisms that sniff out or suss out cheating in advance if it can, and direct cooperation away from those who would cheat and towards those who won't, would be selected for. But no one can predict the future with perfect certainty. So sometimes if the potential gains from cooperation are large enough, it sometimes is going to pay to take the chance of trying to acquire them, even if, in particular instances, they don't always work out. Therefore, mechanisms of what you might call social foraging that attempt to engage new relationships when the cues predict they would work out would be selected for as well. And just keep this in mind for now. I'm going to move on, but come back to it a little bit later. At the same time as this, ancestral hominids, and indeed most creatures in the world, live in a world with competition over resources. Imagine that you have Steve and Bill, or actually let's make that Bill and that Steve. They're both fighting over an apple. Steve is more likely to win to the extent that he's stronger than Bill, or wants the apple more than he does. In these cases, Bill is likely to be more hurt in the fight than he even values the apple in the first place, and so he should really walk away rather than risk getting hurt. From this toy model, you can see that given conflicts of interests and potential asymmetries in valuation and fighting costs, mechanisms that suss out these variables would be strongly selected for. And indeed, many species engage in what look like ritualistic pre-fight displays that communicate precisely these variables about formidability and valuation between opponents. And many fights in the animal kingdom are avoided because of it. Keep this one in mind as well. Tonight, Joe and I were asked to speak to some big questions in the field, such as what are the mechanisms that are responsible for large-scale cooperation in humans? And do we need cultural group selection processes in order to explain them? To what extent is an individual's behavior, like their willingness to cooperate or punish, their expectations of others, their moral intuitions, determined either by culturally transmitted social norms or instead an evolved facultative psychology? Is group selection a useful framework for thinking about the evolution of social behavior? And does it explain why humans have religion or explain why monogamy spread in our recent history? And what's with our weird psychology compared to those in other parts of the world? I can't do justice to all of these questions in the time I have, but abstractly, these questions all center around how to best explain and how to best understand the origins and variety of human society. How did we get from a hominin that was more like a chimp to a language and tool-using, hunting and gathering, complexly cooperating human? And what do we make of the range of contemporary human cultures that go from those of us living in traditional societies to the rest of us in the industrialized, educated, rich, democratic West? Putting on the hat of representing capital E, capital P psychology, evolutionary psychology, let me outline the view as I see it. Because I think it's a little bit different than the view that Joe was just characterizing. On this view, many of the mechanisms that underlie our sociality are going to have long histories into our deep ancestry that are going to well predate the modern cultures of the last tens of thousands of years. And these mechanisms are going to be myriad. So mechanisms of social exchange, partner choice, interpersonal bargaining and conflict management, social learning, mate choice, coalition management, foraging, on and on and on. Many of these mechanisms evolved over regularly variable conditions, so they should in fact be designed to be calibrated by local physical, social, and informational conditions. Because some of what these mechanisms calibrate to is in fact the very social environment that they shape through their action, the output, in a sense, of your mechanism becomes the input to mine. That's what can calibrate my mechanism over time. And so linking these processes together giving them time to feed back on each other directly predicts both changes in a culture over time and regional variation in cultural forms. And at long time scales, this feedback should in fact alter the gene frequencies themselves. And so, as Joe mentioned, we in fact predict adaptations for culture. Some of the cultural differences that we end up getting are going to be explainable in terms of the predictable dynamics of this evoked culture feeding back in on itself, while others are just maybe better understood as idiosyncrasies of historical circumstance. Reading Joe's work from his career and listening to the way that he was presenting it tonight, it's been hard for me to tell to what extent he acknowledges that these are actually predictions of an evolutionary psychological approach, or if he thinks some other theory like cultural group selection is needed to even get you this far. But to my mind, at least, he's been crystal clear on the fact that we need theories of cultural group selection in order to understand some aspects of human culture. And maybe some of what I would put into this category, but certainly some of what I would put into this category of stuff that we just can't explain from evolutionary theory. Now, to you guys, if you step back from this and from, you know, the mind, the voice in my head that's been arguing about this for better part of a decade and a half, you might ask, all of this just looks like evolution and you're doing mostly the same thing. What's all the fuss about? Why are you having this debate? This is a really hard knot to untangle, and it takes me the better part of 4 weeks in my undergraduate class to do it. I'm going to try to do it in 2 minutes. There's a huge difference, I think, between what you would call an adaptationist approach to these questions and a functionalist approach to these questions. We're probably all on board with the functionalist perspective, that understanding the brain, the behavior that it produces, the culture that it produces, can be made better if we understand the functions that it's affording, the functions that are being accomplished. But not all kinds of functions are going to have the same utility for our theories. Some of these functions are going to be adaptive functions, adaptations, while others are going to be mere byproducts. Adaptive functions are only those functions that resulted in gene frequencies getting pushed around to accumulate into mechanisms, or memes getting pushed around to accumulate cultural mechanisms. Therefore, adaptive functions predict other design features of the mechanism, because they're responsible for why those things were getting pushed around in the first place, whereas other functions that the mechanism affords does not predict that. Here's an example that Joe alluded to using the work of our colleague Dan Lieberman. So we're a bipedal species, and we have lots of mechanisms that enable bipedal balance and so forth, and they allow us to do a number of things. They allow a few different functions. We can run, and we can skateboard. These are two functions that the mechanism affords. In fact, you could probably look at the distribution of these behaviors around the world and find there to be cultural differences. They may be associated with this or that in lots of interesting ways. But which of these functions better explains the design of the mechanisms that enable these behaviors? Which function actually moved gene or meme frequencies around in the past in order to construct the complex mechanism that enables the behavior? The running theory here clearly wins because it was at least ancestrally possible. In a world that didn't have skateboards, you couldn't have mechanisms for skateboarding. But it wins for another reason as well. And the reason is that it successfully predicts lots of other features of the organism. As Joe mentioned, the arched feet and springy tendons that give us the potential to transfer energy from one step to the next, a nuchal ligament that stabilizes our head during the jerky motion of running. In contrast, all of these mechanisms enable us to skateboard, but the function of skateboarding doesn't explain, and a bunch of other features. Yeah. The function of skateboarding doesn't explain these other features of the mechanism nearly as well. Therefore, the difference between an adaptationist theory and merely functional storytelling is that if you've identified the adaptationist function of a mechanism, you can successfully predict other features that it has. So let me give you an example that I think illustrates this point, the power of an adaptationist theory. Remember our mechanisms of interpersonal conflict and aggression? The adaptive problem here is to leverage your own formidability relative to others to get the goodies of society. Ancestrally, this mechanism was going to find itself over time in bodies that were strong, in bodies that were weak, in bodies that were male, in bodies that were female, in bodies that had no allies, and in bodies that had lots of allies. And so it therefore needed to be sensitive to cues that predicted the utility of personal aggression in the body that it found itself, like how formidable is the force that's standing in your way. Some of the cues, like this, are going to be cultural institutions or cultural structures that increase the costs of violence, which would then suppress violence, but also change the other parameters of society, enabling, for example, more coordinated interests amongst these people and amongst the people that they're oppressing or enforcing against. Run this process out, and at least sometimes you'll end up with an institution like our police force that all but co-opts the authority for using violence. That should dial this mechanism's perception of the costs of aggression all the way to 11, ramping down the impulse for us to use personal force to get our way and leading towards further declines in violence. Our colleague Steve Pinker has documented this precise pattern over human history, and while this is not the only mechanism leading to the decline of violence, it's certainly at least one of them. So without any intergroup competition, without cultural group selection, you can get changes both in cultures over time and in space. Yet, these are just some of the inputs to the mechanism that you can predict in advance if you have this adaptive function in mind. Individuals, even in the same society, in the same group, in the same culture, would have differed ancestrally in their strength, and therefore their utility to use anger and aggression to get their way. My good friend Aaron Sell has tested for the legacy of this selection by seeing if muscle strength in fact calibrates our psychology of personal aggression, even in the industrialized West where we have all of these institutions co-opting personal violence. And in fact robustly does. Here is some data from just one of his many data sets replicating these effects. It turns out the stronger you are, the more likely you are to get angry when you're offended, the more likely you are to get in fights in your lifetime, the more entitled you feel to resources in your environment and status from others and respect, the more you're likely to think that fighting it is an okay and legitimate way of settling conflicts in between people. But because the costs of aggressive conflict ancestrally for hominids that do a lot of maternal investment would have been higher for ancestral women than men, these relationships should not in fact be found in women, and in fact they aren't. None of these differences are significant. Moreover, our attitudes towards international aggression, like warfare, our norms of when it's okay to go to war with other countries, could in fact be a reliable byproduct of this mechanism. So if so, it would show the same pattern. Note, you could construct a cultural group selection model of our attitudes of warfare. You could propose or suppose that groups that had attitudes of warfare that happened to get groups to be more competitive with other groups or more successful in intergroup conflict would spread at the expense of those less good views. But that theory doesn't predict other features of the mechanism that are directly predicted by the evoked psychology of interpersonal bargaining or conflict view. That individual strength in men, but not women, should predict these attitudes towards warfare. And in fact, they do. It's as if these norms, these attitudes towards what our nation should do, are completely jointly regulated by the same mechanism that regulates my attitudes towards interpersonal bargaining and all the rest. In fact, warfare norms, if you want to call them that, aren't the only beliefs that this mechanism calibrates. In some follow-up work, these researchers found that stronger men, but not women, advocated more for their own interests in tax policy than weaker men did. That is, if you're rich, the stronger you were, the more you opposed redistributing your resources to others. But the weaker you were, the more you supported it. If you're poor, and you were strong, the more you supported redistributing others' resources to you, but if you were weak, you opposed it. But this relationship was only again found for men and not women. We can therefore predict the political attitudes of different people in the same culture, subject to the same norms, based on the strength of their muscles, because the evoked psychology is the same across all these people. What's more, the pattern holds even in radically different cultures with respect to norms of redistribution, from a pinnacle of Scandinavian socialism like Denmark to a hotbed of Latin American populism like Argentina. While the cultures of these countries obviously differ, and they're probably weirder than Joe would prefer, the underlying psychology turns out to be the same, because precisely that it's evocable by the exact same parameters. Returning to the example of the psychology of cooperation, a basic adaptive problem that this mechanism is solving is identifying when to take the risk that cooperation is going to pay off. In previous work, I found that if you model a world that has the potential for gains in trade, but uncertainty as to whether those gains in trade are going to work out, organisms tend to evolve a bias to cooperate even when it doesn't seem warranted in order to capture the gains in trade that they would have missed if they were wrong. So what I'm graphing for you here is data from cases where the organisms were pretty sure that there were no gains in trade. In fact, they had some information from the environment and the ability to do Bayesian updating in order to correctly, most rationally, accurately infer that there were no gains in trade to be had. Yet, if there were gains in trade that would have been possible, should the relationship continue into the future, these organisms evolved to cooperate almost all of the time. Now, the potential for gains in trade would have varied ancestrally, depending on important details of the social and environmental ecology, so that the mechanism should be sensitive to the prospect of gains in trade in order to calibrate whether its default trust and generosity should be more like here or more like here. In fact, Joe has data looking at generosity across cultures that falls directly in line with this prediction. Access to a market to exchange your goods on dramatically increases the potential for gains in trade. And it turns out that across cultures, degree of market integration has a strong effect on generous behavior in standard economic games. This gives us a cross-sectional view of how the mechanism could in principle operate over time as well. As Matt Ridley writes in his great book, The Rational Optimist, there's a virtuous positive feedback loop between how lucrative the social behavior is on one hand and the evolved psychology that could benefit from that behavior on the other, such that the bigger the gains in trade are, the nicer I should be to capture them, the nicer I am to capture them, the bigger the gains in trade are going to be that results, pushing the drive to specialize your labor and engage in this ever more lucrative social ecology. Ridley analyzes the last tens of thousands of years of human history and concludes that it's this basic psychology of exchange plus the virtuous cycle of it co-evolving with the culture that it evokes that's responsible for most of the positive change in the human experience that we've seen over this time span. So, if I'm looking correctly, my time is just about up. And hopefully we can get to some of the more big questions in the Q&A. But before I give up the microphone, I wanted to take a beat to comment on the history of this conflict between the views that Joe and I just presented. About 25 years ago, as Richard mentioned, two Harvard grads, Lida Cosmides and John Tooby, synthesized their thinking on this new field of evolutionary psychology into a volume that basically still stands as the formal foundation of the field. And they didn't bury the lead on how much they were trying to talk to everyone who was interested in studying culture. The subtitle of the book was Evolutionary Psychology and the Generation of Culture. The first chapter of the book, their first chapter of the book, which is a 117-page treatise on why evolutionary psychology is necessary for understanding culture, is titled The Psychological Foundations of Culture. And among other sections on culture, there's an entire 10-page section devoted to understanding their approach in relation to other approaches on culture from other fields, evolutionary psychology and the generation of culture. Now, Lida and John do a lot of analysis in this chapter, and if you haven't read it, I highly encourage you to. It's, historical documents that we all must, bow down to. Lida and John summarize a lot of their analysis, though, into the following table, which I think is really helpful. In it, they distinguish three majorly different kinds of thing that we usually conflate when we talk about culture. And when I say we, I mean even the rest of the scientific field that studies culture. The first thing that they distinguish is what they call metaculture. That's everything that can be attributed to human psychology acting in a group context that's divorced of any particular cultural content. This is things like the details of our social psychology, our mentalizing capabilities, our various mechanisms of social learning, etc. Metaculture is in fact necessary for culture, but it's not typically the kind of thing we think of when we think about what culture is. The second category they called evoked culture. And by this they mean the facultative responses of mechanisms that are triggered by local information, like that calibration of your generosity level to local cues of the benefits of gains in trade that you can have that I mentioned earlier. The third category they called epidemiological culture. That is, the cultural contents that propagate from mind to mind, like learning the English lexicon from your local language community. And they purposefully called this epidemiological rather than transmitted culture because it still depends on mechanisms in the mind of the learner to pick up the information. It isn't merely passive transmission. Importantly, mistaking the category of your phenomenon of interest can lead you in the wrong direction. For example, presuming that the individual differences or the cultural differences you see result from epidemiological differences can lead you to ignore better fitting explanations at the level of meta or evoked culture. I'm alluding to the norms of warfare work. Critically, this analysis also shows that each of these forms of culture depend on a massive underbelly of psychological structure and mechanism, such that it's impossible to understand how or why we have the cultures that we do without understanding the mechanisms that give rise to them. To quote John and Lida, by no means do we deny or minimize the existence of emergent phenomenon, such as institutions, or the fact that population-level processes alter the epidemiological distribution of cultural contents over time. The point is simply that cultural and social phenomena can never be fully divorced from the structure of the human psychological architecture or understood without reference to its design. So as such, as I relinquish the microphone, my question to Joe is this. Where did they go so wrong that you've spent the last 20 years proposing psychological mechanisms of culture as an alternative to this hypothesis? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Max. And so we have 20 minutes before the reception starts, and we should get fairly quickly into questions, but just as I tried to provoke Joe and Max into Joe, do you want to into articulating the distinctions between them before we started, and they declined to do that. I would like to see if they can pick them out now, because what we've heard is some extremely rich material explaining particular features of culture and mechanisms by which cultural transmission and evolution might occur. But I think it would still be really helpful if, after listening to each other, you pick out some of the differences. So, Joe, do you want to make a statement after having heard Max?
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that we clearly have different priors on the importance of intergroup competition for shaping cultural evolution and for feeding back. I'm still puzzled as to what Max thinks about the fact that culture might drive genetic evolution. It sounds like, well, actually, I'll just let you answer.
So on that, to that latter question, I think that it's bedrock evolutionary psychological principle, given to us in our historical documents, that should happen. That what John and Lita, and again, apologies for those of you who don't bow down at their feet like I do, what they wrote about in that chapter was precisely that process.
Well, like, what's an example? Like, give me a phenomena that they explained using a gene-culture coevolutionary theory.
So they wouldn't call it gene-culture coevolutionary theory. They wouldn't call it dual inheritance theory.
You don't have to call it that. Just give me
because
a real
that's their background theory.
Well,
so
give me an example.
they would propose that the only reason why you would have mechanisms of social learning in the first place is because you have a social environment that puts you in proximity to the minds of others. And that once you're in proximity to the minds of others and you have mechanisms for exploiting that information, that increases the benefits on maintaining proximity to others, and that would create a feedback loop on creating more and more social cohesion in the group.
So,
Yep.
I mean, part of my program, and the reason why I draw less on them, although I don't think I'm as much in opposition to them as you sort of framed it there at the end, because I wanted to have a theory that would generate where are these learning mechanisms coming from. Like, so why are we cultural at all in the first place? Where did this epidemiological stuff come from? Give me a theory that drove humans in this particular direction that hasn't driven other species. And that's what I don't see in that line of work.
So I would say that you've done incredibly good work on identifying mechanisms of cultural learning, social imitation, etc., that are at a higher level of detail than John and Lita have worked on. But I would say that they would not have ever objected to those mechanisms being part of the package that they were proposing. In fact,
Great.
part of what they were suggesting when they said that there were benefits to social interaction, harvesting information from the minds of others, things that you've previously referred to as the cognitive niche, are the same kinds of things that you talk about in terms of social learning or the cultural niche.
Right. So the question is so when I looked at the cultural niche stuff, I see a list of claims about cognitive adaptations that humans have, but I don't see a detailed description of the evolutionary processes that brought those into existence. So it looks to me like a catalog of suspicions about what important human-specific, not a causal evolutionary theory of the kind that I get excited about.
Sure, and we definitely get excited about different kinds of tools. The approach that I take in my work, and it's in part because of my training, is that the logic of adaptationism actually can give us very powerful predictions. That by understanding simple features of the ancestral ecology and thinking about how simple psychologies can fit to those features in order to extract benefits, we can, without doing formal mathematical models, have a pretty good sense of what a selective regime would have looked like. And that sometimes you don't need a math model in order to prove that.
I haven't said anything about math models. I have all kinds of work doing exactly what you just said. There's my work on prestige, there's my work on morning sickness. So I have a whole track record of doing exactly that. So it's not, I feel like you're trying to say that I don't do this, but I'm on board.
No, I'm not saying that you don't do it. I'm saying that you've built these theories as if you've built these theories as a distinction many times.
Okay.
as a distinction from what the rest of the evolutionary psychology community is doing. And that comes part and parcel with critiquing the methods of evolutionary psychology, like occasionally or more than occasionally doing studies with undergrads, using less formal than math model verbal arguments.
Okay. So so look at, maybe this is our points of difference. So I do think that the field of evolutionary psychology it could improve their theorizing if young or even old ones were better trained in formal modeling, learn some evolutionary game theory, learn these mathematical tools. I do think that the field of evolutionary psychology would benefit from reducing the emphasis on undergraduates and setting up these longitudinal studies to study psychology in different communities throughout the globe to sample the diversity of humanity.
I would agree with you that we should use the best tools that we have in order to answer the questions that we want to answer, and often those questions are not going to be best answered by looking at convenient samples of undergrads. But one of the big priors of the evolutionary psychological perspective is that human nature, what is universal about it, is a big part of human nature. And that certainly there's going to be lots of individual differences and cultural differences. But when you're studying the deep logic of the mechanism, not like how cooperative is this group versus how cooperative is that group, the deep logic of the mechanism should be similar across the globe. So that when you spot check, for example, the way that Larry Sugiyama did with Lita and John, there was a lot of work showing that well-educated Harvard undergrads could increase their reasoning on the social exchange version of the weights and selection task relative to the descriptive rule version of the weights and selection task. We wanted to just do they wanted to just do a spot check to make sure that wasn't an artifact of their educational environment and a really weird environment, even though this predates your coinage of the term weird. They checked amongst hunter-gatherers, the Shuar, to see if they could accomplish the same task, show the same pattern of behavior even in the absence of formal schooling or a written system of language. And in fact, they did. And so the question wasn't, what is the distribution of these things around the globe? How do we characterize the full diversity of human experience? It's, what is the underlyingly universal human psychological architecture? And that is often more, if I can run 10 studies with undergrads at the expense of running half a study in the field, sometimes I might be able to uncover more about the human mind doing the former.
So let me respond to that, because I think a lot of times I see studies from mainstream evolutionary psychology done with undergrads where the inference is automatically that we've uncovered the cognitive architecture. And I think that you're doing experiments with members of your own culture, so you see a result that fits with your own intuitions. It feels like you must be getting it, but like in the case of this work on whether people have an innate mechanism to allocate benefits according to merit or according to contribution, you do it amongst undergraduates, you do it amongst Western kids, it looks like good. You do it in Kenya, you get a totally the opposite answer. And there's 2 or 3 studies like that now showing that these things which were thought to be this kind of evolved mechanism turns out to just vary across societies.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't work on weird people because you have all the wrong intuitions. Everything, it looks right to you because that's what you would do.
Well, this is a really useful discussion, and so we've identified 2 or 3 things that are little points of difference, but at the same time you're converging on the same points. You agree that cross-cultural validation is good, if nothing else. I'd like to ask one other question before turning it over, and that is about your views on the role of cultural group selection as an evolutionary mechanism, because much of culture hangs on cooperation of one kind or another. Cooperation is often thought of as coming from some kind of group selection mechanism. I think that neither of you want to advocate for genetic group selection, but you can if you wish. But I think that we should be aware that, on the one hand, Joe, you spoke about the importance of cultural group selection in your view. And on the other hand, Max, you have written articles saying things like ultrasociality does not depend on cultural group selection. So it'd be really nice to hear an articulation of what you think cultural group selection is and why it does or does not apply. Joe.
Would you like to?
Yeah, so I have several chapters on this. So First I go to historical cases and ethno-historical cases. So you can look at hunter-gatherers, whether you look at the Inuit or the Pama-Nyungan expansion in Australia or the expansion of hunter-gatherers in the Great Basin. In each case, you have a group that has a particular package of rituals and institutions that is able to spread at the expense of others. In the case of the Australian Aborigines, they actually have rules that force them to intermarry with other groups that allow them to maintain interconnections, and they're able to gradually move out or pull in other groups. And you see this massive expansion across Australia in the last 16,000 years. Then we have smaller scale case studies. So the famous case is the case of the Nuer and the Dinka. These are two groups who were historically related, but one happened to get a particular institution called a segmentary lineage system, and several groups in Africa got this. And those groups, because of the nature of the segmentary lineage system and the way it allows you to pull many people together, were able to gradually move the Nuer out. And so you had the spreading of Nuer practices at the expense of Dinka, so a change in the frequency of cultural traits based on that. And you can also do this in the lab. So you can put people in cooperative dilemmas, and then if you let the groups interact, you'll get the favoring of certain kinds of institutions, say with punishment or whatever mechanism you want to put in. So you can simulate it in the lab. There's also historical cases of utopian communities. So this is research done by Rick Sosis, where you have a whole bunch of utopian communities that start up 19th century America. And some have more rigorous rituals that, you can tell different stories. Rich has a kind of costly signaling story. I mean, this has got to be cultural evolutionary costly signaling, which gets everybody kind of cooperating. Other groups adopt less rigorous rituals, and what you get is the proliferation of the groups with the tougher rituals. And I mean, Rich actually doesn't have the Mormons in them, but they're really one of these groups, and now they're, almost a global religion. So it's a combination of historical and ethnographic evidence. Now, there's a kind of people who were raised in a certain era within evolutionary thinking have a kind of knee-jerk reaction. So if Rob Boyd could go back in history, he would just give it a different name, because the word group selection seems to cause, that must be stupid. Because these models don't suffer the kinds of problems that are the Achilles heel of genetic group selection models. So it does make some historical sense to call it group selection, because if you use the famous George Price formation, you can partition the variance between groups and within groups. So for that reason, it makes sense to call it group selection. But because these things form the stable interlocking equilibriums that I talked about, you don't have the kind of effects of migration that deplete the between group variance that's the Achilles heel of group selection.
Okay.
Thank you, Joe. I just want to say that it seems to me that a much better term for it is group-culture selection, because what it draws attention to is that what you're talking about is selection among group cultures. Max.
Okay. So I think that Joe has definitely put his finger on something sociologically that's true of of evolutionary scientists of a certain age or era, that there is a reaction to anything that has the words group selection in it. However, I don't think that cultural group selection is stupid. I don't think that group selection is stupid. I think that group selection of its various forms and variants are mathematically coherent statements. My issue is that I don't think they predict things in the way that otherwise evolutionary psychological explanations predict things. And I would like to just contrast. So there's absolutely an important role for ethnography, documenting history. But in contrast to the example where an evolutionary psychological approach to interpersonal bargaining mechanisms could predict lots of features of the mechanism, in all of my reading, and certainly you're better read than me on this issue, in all of my reading on cultural group selection arguments, it has been much more about documenting these cases where something spread at the expense of something else, and not saying, okay, therefore we can predict X, Y, and Z and test this theory, that this mechanism evolved because of cultural group selection, as opposed to an otherwise sensible alternative theory.
Well, so the counterexample to that is the work I've done on religion and the work I've done on monogamy, where if you say that, well, what kinds of supernatural beliefs would allow people to cooperate with distant co-religionists? Well, first of all, the God has to be powerful. They have to be able to create incentives. They have to care about particularly those things which people have problems with. So they don't demand that mothers love their babies. They demand that people behave well with strangers. So that gives you a bunch of predictions, and you would expect the god to care about certain rituals, because rituals can have the power to deepen people's faith. So that's, there's a whole set of things you can predict about the features of successful kind of religions that are able to get groups to work together. In the case of monogamous marriage, there's a whole bunch of downstream predictions you can make. So the idea is that, well, there's a whole bunch of sub-ideas, but once in most human societies, 85% are polygynous, right? And in polygynous societies, the wealthy, high-status men take a disproportionate number of the women. It doesn't take very much. Very light polygyny will leave you with a big pool of unmarried, low-status guys. The only way those guys can get in the mating market, they haven't evolved psychology, is to take big risks that spike them up into the top. So if you have some kind of set of social norms that, I don't like the economic terminology, but redistributes the women so that you can have one woman per man, you marry off those poor low status guys, and they can begin, rather than taking those big risks, they can take more incremental steps. They have children, now they have a paternity thing, they have a stake in the future. You actually change their biology. You lower their testosterone levels. You cause them to take fewer risks. You cause them to discount the future less steeply. You also change the nature of the family. So if you look at polygynous families, they have, they're not very related. So one of the piece of evidence from Martin and Margot, two famous evolutionary psychologists, is that stepmothers, or stepfathers in particular, but also step-parents, are particularly bad for the health of their children. Well, in a polygynous household, you have lots of step-parents. There are these women who are unrelated to the other children in the household. So there's good data, I think, on the effects of polygyny on mortality of children. So, I can go on and on. I have quite a lot of work on this, but that's just one example where I think you get a rich set of predictions from this approach.
So I've been a lousy moderator because we were supposed to have like 20 minutes of questions and we got 20 seconds of questions. But let's just have a ritual opening of the question time and see if we can get a couple of questions in. Yes?
I have a question about whether science can offer an explanation for the kind of moral outrage that we've seen many examples of recently. The people of Iceland were so outraged that they forced the prime minister out and apparently threw yogurt at the parliament building. They were so upset about his tax shelter. So I wonder, can science address what makes people within groups become morally outraged about leaders or other people?
You take it next.
Sure. I think that the answer to that question is absolutely yes. The way that I at least understand the psychology of outrage is that part of the adaptive problem it solves is coordinating people that have potentially divergent interests into a more cohesive whole that can then achieve a more common goal. So while all of those people who were outraged, who ended up being outraged at the prime minister, in the absence of that outrage eliciting event, they suffered a common knowledge problem, right? So maybe you think the prime minister is shady, but you don't know that I know that you know that I know that the prime minister is shady, and so should we actually take the costs of doing something, mobilizing against him? If I end up being the only one who does it, it's not likely to be successful, and I'm likely to take lots of the burden on myself. When there's one of these common knowledge coordinating, outrage eliciting events, it can coordinate all of our interests, all of a sudden reach into our heads, change the parameters on like how beneficial is this likely to be, what is the cost that I'm likely to pay, all of a sudden that satisfies the input criteria to the mechanism, and outrage is elicited, and action happens. And so I think that this is exactly the kind of thing that you can understand from an evolutionary psychological perspective.
One more question. Z.
Probably like a number of people in the room, I'm trying to figure out what the differences are between these two perspectives, since I think there's an awful lot of convergence. So here's one possibility, and I think I'll direct it at Joe. When you talked about the cultural innovation in this subgroup of the Arapesh, was it, the Sepik River? So they came up with the idea that if you had these moieties that cross-cut clan solidarity, you could have a bigger group before it started to fraction on kin-based grounds. And not coincidentally, that group did pretty well. It was pretty big, it was pretty formidable, couldn't be wiped out by other groups, which is absolutely fascinating. But maybe this is the difference. you described that innovation as an error in copying a practice from a neighboring, I guess it was a subgroup of the Arapesh?
No, it's
Or
the
different.
Abram. It's another ethno-linguistic.
Another ethno-linguistic group. And you, I think, want to invoke the size and success of the group as an explanation as to why this moiety organization arose, in the same way that reproductive success in the biological evolution case explains how an adaptation came to be, to evolve.
Okay, I'm getting. Keep going. I'm agreeing less with what you're saying.
Okay, so this is. Well, I guess I'm attributing a position to you, so maybe you're going to disavow the position that I attribute to you. Whereas I think Max, in emphasizing the sophistication of cognitive and other evolved adaptations, might say, and maybe, Max, you can disavow this if this is incorrect, is this a copying error in the sense that if you look at all of the different ways in which neighboring groups could have copied each other's cultural practices, they're just kind of random typographical errors, mishearings, substitutions, or did some genius think, hey, we've got a problem. As our group gets bigger and bigger, people start to get on each other's nerves, and a bunch of male relatives break off, and then we become more vulnerable. Right. Wouldn't it be great if I figured out some way in which people who weren't so closely related would feel solidarity? Maybe this moiety organization would keep us more formidable. Hence, they became more formidable. But the fact that they were more formidable doesn't explain how they adopted this innovation, right. Nor was it literally an error in the sense of a mishearing.
Right.
It may have been an act of genius.
So both the well, first of all, it really would have to have been an act of genius because the Abram didn't figure it out, and none of the surrounding groups figured it out. But the reason why both Tuzin and I think it was an error is because there's a tradition of copying these cults all throughout New Guinea. And the crucial thing is that you copy it exactly, because the ritual has to be done exactly how the god wants it, otherwise it doesn't work. So there was a big incentive to get it exactly right. If some genius said, I don't think we should do it the way they did, people would be like, no way, we got to do it exactly that way, otherwise it doesn't work. So there's good reason to think it was a transmission error.
I think we have to end there. I'd like to thank the Harvard Mind Brain Behavior Graduate Student Steering Committee. I'd like to recognize the fact that it's not easy doing one of these debates and presenting all this material and responding so wonderfully to each other. Seems to me a real achievement. Thank you very much for coming.